Discover the power of music to heal and uplift. Introducing NeuroVibe, where rhythm meets recovery. NeuroVibe fuses ambient music textures with rhythmic layers to create music that goes beyond relaxation. It's crafted to resonate deeply, perfect for relaxation, self-reflection, or therapeutic sessions. NeuroVibe invites you to connect with your inner self through immersive sound. Explore NeuroVibe today on SoundCloud and experience the transformative power of music. Tune in, find your vibe, and discover what NeuroVibe can do for you. For more information, check out NeuroVibe on SoundCloud today at soundcloud.com/NeuroVibe-brainspotting. NeuroVibe is intended for general wellness and relaxation purposes and is not a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Explore NeuroVibe now on SoundCloud. Dive in, find your rhythm, and feel better with NeuroVibe.
Welcome to Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered with Perry Clark. This program looks at mental health from unique perspectives and shows you how to manage your life by finding the knots that help you and stay away from the ones that could be a disadvantage. Now, here is your host, Perry Clark.
Hello all, welcome back to Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered. I'm Perry Clark, licensed marriage and family therapist, here with you. And I want to remind you, as always, that this podcast is for entertainment and educational purposes. It does not constitute working with a mental health provider. Please seek one out in your area to work on your unique issues. So, today's episode, and I send many thanks to past guests, Lauren and her husband, Justin, who wrote the Little Brain Little Brain is their publishing company, and they introduced me to my guest today, who also wanted to consult about some materials for their own projects in the future. But I've wrote a very great treat for those of you who are interested, not just in comics or in Afrofuturism or even in horror. We have what I would call, in many ways, a true renaissance from the number of things this person has brought together. And I know they're smiling at that. But I want to introduce you to Dr. Stanford W. Carpenter, a.k.a. Brother Story, a cultural anthropologist, sometimes comic creator, former archaeologist, whether it's through the lens of ancient worlds, Afrofuturism, or Ethno Gothic, which we're going to talk about. He conducts ethnographic research among comic creators with an archaeologist sensibility that teases out the relationship between people, place, time, and things. Dr. Carpenter recently developed coursework and film series for Illinois State University and the Normal Theater, focusing on Ethno Gothic and Blaxploitation. His forthcoming book for Fantagraphics Press explores the culture and history of Black comics creators and characters. Dr. Carpenter has developed and moderated virtual programs for the Chicago History Museum that explored Chicago's history, Black life, Black horror, and Afrofuturism in Candyman and in Lovecraft Country. Dr. Carpenter wrote introductions for the Book of Bones, Invisible Man, the trailblazing Black artist of Black comics, and the Black representation in the world of animation, and back matters for Bitterroot and Frank P's Little Nemo. Dr. Carpenter has written on issues related to anthropology and identity in comics for Comics as a Philosophy, the Green World Encyclopedia of Comics and Comic Novels, Third Person, Authoring and Exploring Vast Narratives, What is a Superhero, and Critical Approaches to Comics. His comic artwork can be found in Black Comics Returns, and Cosmic Underground, a grimoire of Black speculative fiction. Dr. Carpenter has taught anthropology, media studies at Illinois State, the School of Art Institute of Chicago, Johns Hopkins University, Rhode Island School of Design, Grinnell College, and University of Maryland College Park. So with such a distinguished list, welcome to the show, Dr. Carpenter.
I'd have recommended the short version.
Yeah, well, let me play up your titles so people can understand. Since we are going to be playing this for Black History Month, and I think, hey, let's show your accolades because you've achieved something that so many would those, especially those who are blurs, would love to have titles with that and have that knowledge.
Okay, well, shoot.
Little appreciation. But as always, I ask the question, how did you get here, especially with a list like that?
I guess the best thing I could say is that I never had a as much of a goal as I have had ideas that I was pursuing and processes that I was interested in.
Mhm.
I mean, since I was a kid, I always wanted to do stuff with comics. I ended up at a really great undergrad institution, Oberlin College. And when I was there, there was no comic major to be had. So I just took
Mhm.
courses and things that I hadn't, quite frankly, I hadn't heard of. So archaeology was one of those courses that I knew very little about that I did well in, and I came back for more. And then
Mhm.
I also had really great mentors along the way. And I just kind of followed. Throughout, I would argue that there are certain questions that I have followed and continue to follow. And part of the interdisciplinarity of my work is not even a reflection of wanting to engage a gajillion disciplines. It's really a reflection of my having a question and following it wherever it took me.
Mhm.
So, I stumbled on archaeology. I was trained as a map maker and site illustrator. I did that for a minute. I also had a weekly comic strip at a Black newspaper in the Pacific Northwest. While I was doing that, I was still in touch with one of my archaeology advisors, and she was looking at I'd sent her copies of the comic strip, which is retelling African folk tales.
Mhm.
And she knew that I had gotten them from folklorists and anthropologists, and she said to me on the phone, she's like, you said you were going to New York to visit some people. And I was like, yeah. And she's like, well, while you're there, you should drop in on the Department of Anthropology to see what they think of what you're doing.
Mhm.
And I was like, okay. And then she called me a couple other times to remind me that that's what I was supposed to do. And her name was Linda Grimm. Amazing. She was a professor who, like I said, she was always in my corner. And the
Mhm.
fact that we were in contact years after I completed my work at Oberlin says something right there. So when I was there, I cold called several departments of anthropology and one of them,
Mhm.
Columbia University. While I was there, I got into a long conversation with Michael Tausig, and I had my comics with me. I wasn't operating like a grad student. I just showed up with my comics. I was like, "Hey, look at
Mhm.
these. I want to talk to you about
Right.
them." And we got into this really long conversation, and he encouraged me to think about coming to grad school. So, mind you, when I graduated Oberlin, I went to my archaeology advisors, Linda Grimm and Bruce Simonson, um, and I was like, this is a quote. Thank you for helping me get out in 4 years. I'm never opening another book again. I'm going to become a cartoonist somewhere.
Right.
And I mean, Bruce belly laughed at that one because Bruce Simonson's older brother is Walter Simonson,
Okay.
the comic creator, and he'd given me his brother's phone number, so I was able to look
Mhm.
him up, and Walter and Louise Simonson have both been very strong influences for me throughout my journey. But yeah. I came back. I was like, oh, what the heck? I knew that my strip was not going to last much longer, not because people weren't responding to it, but because I had certain editorial restrictions on it.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, there's only so many stories I can tell like this. So I put it on indefinite hiatus. So technically it's still on hiatus decades later.
Right.
But I went to Columbia for my master's degree in cultural anthropology. And then while I was there, still not acting like a grad student, I had created some art projects that were based in anthropology. And so I created this like activity book for adults dealing with Elias Canetti's Crowds and Power. And I sent them to other anthropologists around the country, just sent them in the mail. and then sent a note to them saying, hey, I'd love to talk to you about this. What do you think? Mind you, this is the 90s, right? Like there's no social media. Like I'm just trying to imagine like what I'm just trying to imagine what George Marcus thought when he just received this envelope in it, So I did that. And then I also met one of my longtime mentors who I'm still in touch with to this day, Patricia Williams. She was teaching in the law school, but she also, her classes were cross-listed in anthropology. I met her because Mick Tausig had this thing in his classes where he would require that one of the students present a reading to class before he would talk about it. And there was just one period where he's like, oh, I'm switching up we're switching up the weeks because one of the readings is by a friend of mine, and she's going to come here to the class, and this is the only week that works with her schedule. He's like, who wants to present it? And everybody was just quiet. And I'm one of those people who abhors the silence. And I was like, well, maybe we'd have a better idea of whether we want to do this if you could tell us, like, I don't know, like
a little
how
about
long is this book? How complicated is it? Because we only got a week. And he just turned and looked at me and he said, in his Australian accent, he was like, oh, mate, it's like 150 pages. Big text. You'll be fine. So there I was presenting Alchemy of Race and Rights to the class the next week with Patricia Williams sitting right there staring at me.
Yeah, pressure, none.
And so after the class was done, she left early. And like it was like the next day, I looked up her office and I went over to her office and I knocked on the door, and I remember her opening the door, and I reintroduced myself, and I started by apologizing to her for like what must have been not a great interpretation of her book. And then she
surely was not that at all.
Well, what it is that the thing I picked up on were the stuff having to do with the metaphors, and I like a lot of the theoretical stuff I kind of went past. And she's like, well, actually, you're the first person that's ever talked about the metaphors. Everyone always wants to talk about the theory. So that became so we had a conversation. Of course, I kid you not, I always had my comics in my backpack. And so I showed her some of my comics and she liked them. And she ended up being my advisor through the completion of my MA. And then she stayed on and also advised me while I was working my PhD at Rice University.
Very nice.
So that was the other thing. After I sent my comics out to professors all around the country, 3 professors at Rice got back to me and they said, hey, if you're ever in town, stop by. We'd love to talk to you. And so I was like, okay. So I scheduled, this is back when you could schedule a layover pretty much anywhere in the country for any amount of time. Right. I scheduled a 3-day layover in Houston, Texas on my way from New York to San Francisco. And, so Steven Tyler, Julie Taylor, George Marcus. I met with all of them, and when I left, George was like, "You really should apply to our program." And by then, I knew that that Columbia wasn't the long-term place for me.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I had some really great supporters, but I also didn't feel like I had like broad enough support to do the things I really wanted to do.
Mm-hmm.
And so yeah, I applied, and I'd completely forgotten about it. It was a rainy day in New York, and I had walked to the Village from 116th Street, and and when I left, it wasn't raining, and when I came back, it was pouring,
Mm.
and I didn't bring an umbrella. So I get back, I'm soaking wet, and there's a message on my phone, and it's
Mm-hmm.
George Marcus inviting me into their program. And I didn't believe it. I actually made my roommate come over and listen to it to tell me that that was real and I wasn't dreaming. And that's, but it was like, I bring that up because it goes back to what I said earlier about how for me it was always about the questions.
Right.
So I had questions. I always had questions about comics. My first sets of questions were really about, like, I was fascinated with the structure and the way it told stories, right? This blending of
Mm-hmm.
words and pictures. And then I was also horrified by the lack of representation, and not just the representations that weren't there, but also by the representations that were there. So I had this love-hate relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I love superheroes. I thought that they were fascinating, and they made sense for me as a young Black kid, um, growing up in what me and my friends later would refer to as a melanin deficient zone. So,
Mm-hmm.
mostly white suburbs in Illinois and Ohio and Pennsylvania. Um, so there I was at Rice, and what was incredible about my experience there was that um, one of the things that George did was he only let in as many students as he could fully fund.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, my class were like four of us. So the tenured faculty outnumbered the incoming class, which
Mm-hmm.
meant that we had a lot of one-on-one time, a lot of if you didn't do the reading, there was no hiding.
Mm-hmm.
you know, I mean, I would usually have, all of us would have office hours with, you know, with different faculty members, and like my office hours with Julie Taylor were where we'd always end up going out to eat somewhere. Um, and she would give me a whole bunch of reading, and she'd grill me on the reading. First in the office, then we'd go out to eat. We'd go grab a bite to eat, and the grilling would just continue, right?
Mm-hmm.
With George, it was usually over coffee, and then like with Ben Lee, um, it was usually at this sort of watering hole called the Gingerbread Man.
Mm-hmm.
So there's like this interesting theme of like a different drink associated with each of my with each of my
Each of your
advisors.
advisors.
But what was interesting, what was great about it was that one-on-one interaction also created a sense of accountability.
Mm-hmm.
Like I said, you couldn't hide. Um,
Right. Well,
so
it's also relationship building too.
right. The other thing that was interesting was Rice had a policy where no matter who you were as a faculty member, you had to teach undergraduate students.
Mm-hmm.
And that meant that there weren't a lot of TA-ships. So one of the things that George did at the time was basically, we all got, we had our fellowships, we all got a stipend. And he was like, you have to do something in Houston that is somehow related to your work. And so I was able to use that to be a working artist in Houston while working on my PhD
Mm-hmm.
around representation in comics.
Beautiful.
And that opened up a whole other set of doors to me. It allowed me to I mean, I wasn't doing comics. I was doing more bringing comics into the fine art scene of Houston, but it meant that I had a very different type of interaction. I was around a lot of debates amongst artists about representation as opposed to critics.
Right.
And that was incredibly important. And then one of the painters who I became friends with, David McGee. He's a very well-known painter now. And this was just before he really blew up. I'll never forget, I had this idea to do at Project Row Houses to do a cartoon house. Because at Project Row Houses, you're given a shotgun style row house. Like when you get the gig, they give you the keys to a shotgun style row house, and you have to turn that into an art project.
Now, just for those wondering, what is a shotgun house? I know what one is, but could you explain?
It's one of those single floor wood houses that's raised up the ground. They call it a shotgun style house because if you put a shotgun in and you pull the trigger, you'll hit everybody inside. This was in a section of Houston where they're actually thinking about demolishing the houses, and a group of artists saved it and then divided it up between sort of art installation spaces, spaces for teaching and for programming, and then spaces for services for unwed mothers. And so I had this idea that I was going to turn my house into a cartoon that you could walk into. And it was entitled Imagining the Melanin Free Zone. And it was inspired by something that happened while I was in Portland with a group of friends. And it basically is that, Portland is like one of the least diverse cities in the US. And so I had a group of friends who were all people of color, and we walked into a Thai food restaurant. And I'll never forget Kurt, who he is a lawyer. As we walked in, Nisha and I had walked up further, and he was kind of separated from us. And then he looked behind us, and these three white women walked in, and which is the norm for Portland, right? But they were all wearing a sweater that was black and tan with some sort of black and tan pattern and blue jeans. And I remember we just started bantering back and forth. It was like, wow, it looks like something out of a Robert Palmer video. And then I can't remember which of us blurted out. It was like, yeah, I guess you could call this I guess you could call this a melanin free zone. And then the retort was, nah, because we're here, it's melanin deficient. It'll be melanin free when we leave. And and we just had so many jokes when we were hanging out, because we're like, wow, like, should we really be driving together? Because if something happens, it'll really ruin their stats, right? Stuff like that. And so here I am in Houston, and I created this exhibition called Imagine the Melanin Free Zone. And so you walk in, and I had whitewashed the entire interior and repainted only what I wanted you to see. So like the brick, there was a brick post in the center, and I'd done black lines in the grout, so it actually looked like a cartoon. I'd done a series of like just giant pieces representing the newspaper that I was doing the comic strip for. I had actually done the comic strip in, like, they weren't quite life size, but the characters were like about 4 feet tall on another wall. And then the other space was like, I had an art table, and I had I had a whole bunch of files of my, and photocopies of like just artwork that I had done. And we just varnished them to the floor and to the, onto the, and I fixed them to the art table. And what it allowed us to do is to just create this sense of like, first you go to see the medium that the comic strip appears in, and that I actually found a way to kind of tell the story of us going into the Thai food restaurant, right? And then you see the comic strip, right? And then you see where the artist was, and you see all the echoes and trace remains of the artist. And we also had an answering machine. And so what I did was I did a series of thought balloons with the things that the artist was thinking. And then I had sort of jagged word balloons for like messages that are being left on the that are on the answering machine. But we also, at certain times, we actually had the answering machine going with you can hear voices of people leaving messages. And so it was just this examination of race and space in the melanin-free zone. And so, when I was getting ready to do it, David, I described it to David, and David was he wasn't mean, but he kind of was like, yeah. He didn't think I would be able to do it. He didn't, in terms of my idea, I was like, I'm going to create a cartoon you can walk into. I'm going to create this experience, blah, blah, blah. And he's like, okay. And I remember after the opening, he invited me out to coffee. He's like, you did it. But I bring that up because that type of work has kind of defined a lot of what I've done. I've always done these things that are very comic inspired, but not necessarily like the way you would think of comics.
Nothing that's for the sort of mass consumption side.
Right. I didn't mean for it to be a 10-year project, but I remember when the iPhone first came out and there was the ability, and there are a couple of apps that you could start to do like cartoons and artwork on it. And so I was like, I'm going to do a cartoon or cartoon image a day. And I ended up doing it for almost 10 years. And I didn't, it was just, I started doing it and then the pandemic hit and that's when I stopped, which you would think that the pandemic would be a time when I'd be doing more, not less. But that's a story for another. That's a story.
But you've also been doing it for every day for 10 years and hitting a whole bunch of things that nobody else was prepared for.
Yeah.
To address is like, the mind can get diverted.
Yeah. But even the story behind that was I had made a cartoon about why I did it. And the cartoon just reads, imagine you had a really bad day. So bad that you knew that it would disrupt your creativity. And that's the first part, and there's three other parts, but essentially that's what it is. I had a bad day. Something very bad happened in my life, and I knew that it was going to impact the things I did. So I wanted to have something that I did that was going to force me to carve out a little bit of creative time every day. And so,
anxiety is a big one for creating blocks. I know when I was interviewing William Taylor, and he was talking about the comic he created based off of the anxiety he was having during the pandemic as a way for him to work through it. But that anxiety, in some cases, it can drive people to be creative, but in other ways, it creates those roadblocks.
Right. Well, and that was why I had it. Why I did it such a simple prompt, right? A cartoon image or cartoon. There are some days where all I did was create a cartoon image and stick it in the file.
Right.
But what it is the cartoon images, because everything's digital on the phone, what I would do is I would create these cartoon images, and then I had this program that allowed me to like put things into panels and then put word balloons on them. I would retask different cartoon images to tell different little stories. So it's stuff like that. I mean, the stuff that I recently did at the Normal Theater, right? I got together with a psychologist, and we did a class on we did 2 5-week classes. One 5-week class on the Ethno Gothic, and the Normal Theater it was built in, I want to say 1937, and it's fully restored. So imagine a fully restored 1937 movie theater. They've restored the original Art Deco, all of it. The only modern things in it is that they have a podium. They have a smart podium, and the ability to use the screen to put like what's up on a computer on the screen, a smart screen, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you could also watch, but you could. So that's one of the little holes. The other hole allows you to do like good old fashioned film, right? And so what was really cool was we're doing horror films from the 70s, right? That's the type of theater it was meant to be shown in. And we're doing it, and we required the students to come to the theater. So, and that's where it also started. And because it was at this theater, and the theater is owned by the theater is actually owned by the city of Normal.
Mm-hmm.
So since we were doing it at a theater owned by the city of Normal, we had to keep it open to the public.
Right.
And I always loved that we had to, because it was not one of those moments where had to and want to were kind of one and the same, but we always say had to because we want to make it sound like we were somehow burdened by this whole process. And so what was cool was we were requiring students to come off campus to a movie theater in order to be a class. And they had one of those old fashioned, marquees where they have to, we have to put up each letter. It's not a digital marquee; it's an analog marquee. And each week they would have like all the different movies, and then but you'd show up and here we are, the class is like the other thing they did was we had it as a class, but they also advertised it as a film series to the public.
Right.
So it would be, and this week for the Ethno Gothic film series in flashing lights, and it would be like whatever it was, like Scream, Blackula, Scream, right? And so what was really fun about that was that the students were coming in, and they were in any student today has not been in they've been to a multiplex. They've never been in one of these old theaters.
Right.
And then members of the community could just walk in and see it too. And we made and the other thing we did is we required the students to pay for each viewing. Now, any students that had a hardship, we could do a scholarship for that, right?
Right.
But what was interesting about part of what was interesting about it for me was we required the students to do what any person would have to do to see the movie as if it was in that time. Yeah. And it was great because like this was like a class where like you could buy popcorn, you could munch on your popcorn, like in the first, I remember the first class, they're like, is it okay for us to eat in the class? And I was like, they're selling it in the lobby.
Go get it. Put on your 3D glasses.
Yeah. And we would start the class where the two of us would from our different disciplinary perspectives, we would do a short talk. And then we would actually do trailers, and we dig up the old trailers. So like when we did Scream, Blackula, Scream, we actually also did the trailer for the first Blackula movie. And that's because like there are things in Scream, Blackula, Scream that were more important, and we realized that we could summarize Blackula in 15 seconds, right? That's one trick pony of a movie. So that was what was really cool about it. And then we also had all these people just from the community who would come in, and we actually had like a 60-40 split between students who were taking it as a class and people who were just showing up. And that was really fun because there's a community engagement element to that. We actually had a lot of attention for it. We were successful enough that they had to come back and do a second 5 weeks all on blaxploitation films.
Well, yeah, because there's also that standpoint of whether it's the horror movies or the exploitation movies, there's also an element of nostalgia.
Yes.
For everyone who did grow up during that time watching it, those who have the memories of it and want to recapture that, but let alone it's being introduced to the newer generations and just the outfits, the language. I mean, how many people realize that Nichelle Nichols was in I think it was the Dynamite series or the Dolomite series as well. And it's like not playing her, but playing a very different character. But still, the standpoint is like they were more than just what was on like Star Trek and so forth in the time. So yeah, there's a nostalgia factor in all of it.
And there are some great moments I'll never forget, like after, because we start in the past and work up to the present, and we did the movie Angry Black Girl and Her Monster.
Okay.
And I remember after Angry Black Girl and Her Monster, a group of us are sitting there hanging out, and we're talking about the movie afterwards. Anybody could leave the moment the credits rang, but we'd always have some people who stayed afterwards. And it was like a couple of students, a freshman and a junior, and then this couple in their 80s. And we're all sitting around there talking about Angry Black Girl and Her Monster. And it was just a really interesting moment because like just spanning generations as well, right? So like that's the stuff I love doing. I love doing things that are also experiences that that the experience itself also gets people to look at things in a different way.
Beautiful. And I think that's a good place for us to take a break. And when we come back, we're definitely going to give more definition to what ethnographic or Ethno Gothic is in the second half. But I hope you guys have enjoyed this talk in memory and history, let alone the nostalgia and the way relationships and questions can take us further into the future and into things we enjoy. So stay tuned. We'll be back here on Untying Knots. I'm Perry Clark, I'm licensed marriage and family therapist, here with Dr. Stanford W. Carpenter, Renaissance Man. I'll apply that title. I will apply that title.
Thank you.
Our lives and the world around us can get messy and frustrating. Untangle and Grow Counseling's focus is to untangle that mess and make sense of it so you have a good foundation to build and grow from. Visit us on the web at untangleandgrowcounseling.com. Perry Clark offers individual psychotherapy, couples and family therapy, and adolescence therapy from a variety of coping materials and resources. Visit untangleandgrowcounseling.com for more information.
Discover the power of music to heal and uplift. Introducing NeuroVibe, where rhythm meets recovery. NeuroVibe fuses ambient music textures with rhythmic layers to create music that goes beyond relaxation. It's crafted to resonate deeply, perfect for relaxation, self-reflection, or therapeutic sessions. NeuroVibe invites you to connect with your inner self through immersive sound. Explore NeuroVibe today on SoundCloud and experience the transformative power of music. Tune in, find your vibe, and discover what NeuroVibe can do for you. For more information, check out NeuroVibe on SoundCloud today at soundcloud.com/NeuroVibe-BrainSpotting. NeuroVibe is intended for general wellness and relaxation purposes and is not a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Explore NeuroVibe now on SoundCloud. Dive in, find your rhythm, and feel better with NeuroVibe.
Voice America is on LinkedIn. Connect with us today.
You are listening to Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered. If you have a question or comment about our podcast, send an email to pclark@untyingknotspodcast.com. That's pclark@untyingknotspodcast.com. And now, back to the program.
Hello, all. Welcome back to Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered. I'm Perry Clark, licensed marriage and family therapist, here with Dr. Stanford W. Carpenter, and as I've said before, Renaissance Man. And during the break, we were talking about some beautiful stories about his work and time working with DC Comics and Dark Horse, which we'd love to go into. But one of the ones, as I said, we're going to talk much more about Ethno Gothic because we often, and as you've listened to some of the other episodes, we've talked about Afrofuturism, and especially when I talked with Tanana Reeve Dew, we talked much more about Black horror, but I think she called it Black horror. Now we've got Ethno Gothic as another term, so I'd love to hear more about that since we've referenced it a few times.
Okay, well, let me start off by saying that the term ethnogothic is meant to be a reference to Black horror, how it's experienced, how it's interpreted, how it's understood across cultures. So the idea of ethno culture, and then Gothic, a more reference to traditional horror tropes. The term actually came out of a series of conversations, and I don't even like. I'm not sure if I like using the term conversations because it sanitizes it a bit too much.
Questions that needed to be fine. Questions that got asked that needed to be find a direction.
No, I mean it was arguments. It was drunken banter. It was just these things that happen in life when you have friends, and it's about relationships. And for me, I mean, and I'll actually step back a little bit and say this, which is the reason why these terms are important to me is that I am very fascinated by the ways in which knowledge is produced, in particular, the ways in which knowledge often comes into existence first as like sort of the echoes and trace remains of other types of human interactions. So in this instance, when we're talking about the ethnogothic, I mean, it doesn't even start with horror. It starts with Afrofuturism. But it doesn't really start with Afrofuturism. It actually starts with my longtime friendship with John Jennings. And then how I also have a longtime friendship with Yatasha Womack. So this is many, many years ago. I mean, I hate to say it, but we won't say how long ago it was because it just makes me feel old. But it was a long time ago. John, this was back when John was teaching at University of Illinois. He used to come to Chicago a lot, and he introduced me to his friend Yatasha Womack, and we all got along pretty well, and we would just, John and I'll never forget. John and I went to the first C2E2 together, and then we're like, we made Yatasha go to her first comic convention. It was C2E2, and she was like, "Oh my God, this is so weird." And then she was telling us about this book that she was thinking about writing about Afrofuturism, and we were like, "Oh, let's talk about that." And then that just became sort of a regular part of the things that we would talk about when we were hanging out. Hey, how's it coming with that book that you're working on? Hey, what are you doing? And then there are the movies that we go see. Yatasha lives here in Chicago. She lives very, very close to me, and so like Yatasha and I would during the week, sometimes we'd like sneak away to a movie, and then we'd have all these conversations afterwards, right? And then when John would come up, a lot of times he'd stay here, and and then we get together with other cartoonists. We just have these like gatherings, and so after one of the gatherings, pretty much everybody had left except for Yatasha, and John was staying over, and we were drinking, and there's this moment where discussions about Afrofuturism and hope started turning to like, well, what does Afrofuturism do? like we kind of asked it, like, and it kind of came off like that. It wasn't like we were thinking intellectually, like, what does Afrofuturism do? And then we were talking about hope, we're talking about optimism, and we're like, and John and I were kind of like, well, but the Black experience is not all hope and optimism.
No.
and so we're going back and forth, and then Natasha left, and John and I kept talking, and what was really interesting was we're like, well, how would we deal with these things that don't really fit within Afrofuturism, and that bringing them into Afrofuturism almost like pervert Afrofuturism, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then we're talking about how do we talk about race and trauma, and how do we talk about fear and loathing, and then we're going back and forth, and John used to say it's like, yeah, Stanford, you brought the ethno and I brought the Gothic. and I was like, and like we bandied, and we just got into this game where we were starting to like, how do we come up with words to describe ideas, and like we even talked about maybe like called the Afro Gothic, and we're like you shouldn't, the joke was you shouldn't have to have hair to like be a part of something, and which is a dig at John, because John's shiny bald head, and so yeah, we just started there, and then we fell asleep, and then we came back and picked up the conversation, and then it started to really develop into an idea, and then Yatasha was also in the background of this as well, and then we just started using it around people, and then all of a sudden, like, people who we didn't know started using the term. There have actually been people who've written their dissertations using it. Right? It's just like, oh, okay, so that's how it happens, right? But it also is. It's, in some ways, we started off with ideas that were very comic centric, because we're also talking about the visual, and about how the visual often carries with it trauma, and then we're having conversations about how it is that horror is perceived differently amongst Black people, but also differently amongst different groupings of Black people. Right. So like, and that was part of why we liked using the term the ethno, because we didn't want it to sound like we're saying it's about all Black people respond this way. The idea was to really think about it in terms of different Afro diasporic groups, right?
Right.
And
Africa is going to handle dead differently than the Caribbean is going to handle death than the U.S. is, or anyone who is Afro-Latino anywhere in rest of South America is going to handle the idea of horror, zombies, for lack of a better description, differently depending on each of the different locations.
Correct. And to me that was what was interesting. And John is actually much more of like a horror fanatic than I am, right? Because I'm really, I'll say the word and phrase that I'm most interested in is, the word is wonder, and the phrase is sense of wonder. Right. So I'm very interested in that, and I kind of see horror as the inverse of that. And so yeah, it was just this thing that we started talking about, and that to me is what's interesting, and actually Natasha and I have had a lot of conversations about that, about it is important to preserve the fact that some of these ideas are rooted in relationships. And it's important because it's important for a lot of reasons. One, as a matter of citation. Because if you acknowledge the relationships, you're acknowledging multiple participants, right? But it's also, so it is about citation, but it's also about honoring the relationships. And do we honor the relationships more than the knowledge? And I would argue that it's important in many ways to honor the relationship more.
Well, it's a both and. It's just which one are you doing more, maybe first, or are you making sure they're being done equally as well?
Well, because when you honor the relationship, you end up generating even more knowledge,
Oh yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
I mean, and so those are those that's just a series of conversations that we've been having for longer than I'm going to say.
Hmm.
And you know, so that's where the ethnogothic comes from. But for me, also, what I think has been interesting, and especially coming out of a class that I recently co-designed on the ethnogothic at there's at Illinois State. And what it is we taught this is we had a class. It was a 5-week film class called Exploring the Ethnogothic.
Hmm.
And um, I put my cartoonist hat and we even created branding for it.
Hmm.
And what we did was we went to the Normal Theater, which is a movie theater built in 1937 that's fully restored. It
Right.
has some smart
One you were mentioning earlier.
Yes, it has some smart classroom elements to it that have been
Hmm.
added, but ultimately it is like being in a movie theater from the 1930s. It's got in the front, it's got like one of those marquees with all the flashing
Hmm.
lights, and it's like it's one of those things that any college student today has never experienced before, unless they've gone to an old. You know what I mean? It's
Yeah,
it's not like a multiplex at
yeah.
all. It is. It's got the old school lobby. It's got the little posters out front.
Hmm.
There's nothing. It's not digital.
Right.
Um,
You're not going to
and
get the D-base seats that are supposed to be interactive and give you the such.
exactly. And so the way we set up the class was we had the class at the Normal Theater, and we had
Hmm.
it during one of their normal viewing time slots. And we took the branding and we used it for the posters for the class, for advertise the class. And then the Normal Theater took it and used it to advertise the screenings for the class as a film series called
Right.
Exploring the Ethnogothic.
Right.
So um and what was really fun about it was we what we did was we made it so that all the readings were free, but the students still had to pay to get into the theater.
Right.
Because
As you were
I
mentioning.
and for me, I like that because I wanted the students to actually have a movie going experience. And part of that is
Hmm.
waiting in line.
Right.
Waiting in line as the sun is going down. They come in and there's a lobby, there's popcorn, there's drinks. I mean, I'll never forget the first day one of the students asked if it was okay to eat during class. And my response was, they're selling food and drink in the lobby. Of course.
Which
you
is
know,
also part of the experience.
yeah. And but we had like a 60-40 split between people who were taking the class and people from the community, because
Hmm.
it's a city owned theater. We were required to have it be open to the public. And I like to say we were required, but the reality is that we kind of wanted it
Hmm.
to be that way,
Yeah.
but we emphasize the
Right.
required part because we want to make it sound like we worked really
Right.
hard. um but yeah, so it was great because you actually had people from the community of Normal just interacting with students who have to step off campus by a
Hmm.
couple of blocks. And it was really fun. We would do a little talk at the beginning, and then we would do trailers
Hmm.
for some of the older movies. So like one of the first movies we saw was Screen Blackula
Right.
Scream, and then we also did the trailer for the first Blackula movie.
Hmm.
It was a really cool experience. And back to what I said earlier about like knowledge and relationships, that to me was part of the point of the class.
Hmm.
It wasn't
So,
just the ideas, it was to connect the ideas to activities, to
so
experience.
then, so then let me ask this question then. Between looking at some of those movies from the 70s versus looking at some of the now ethnic Gothic stuff that is being produced today, are you seeing any types of shifts, some more similarities? What are you seeing?
Oh, there's shifts all throughout, right? I mean, in the class we started in the 70s and worked our way up to like 2 years ago. Our last film was angry for the official class was Angry Black Girl and Her Monster.
Gotcha.
But we also saw Talk to Me afterwards as a special screening because we also had special screenings that were part of the Ethno Gothic film series, but weren't part of the class. So the most current movie that we saw was Talk to Me, and it had literally been in the theaters just a couple, it just been pulled from the theaters a couple weeks before we showed it. And that's a lot of what we talked about was how genre was changing, right? What was interesting was talking about Scream by Thaler Scream, not just as a horror film, but as a blaxploitation film, right? And then once we started talking about all the conventions of blaxploitation films, all of a sudden, a lot of it kind of made sense in ways that it didn't before. And then the next week we saw Ganja and Hess, which is more of an art house film,
right?
We saw, we also, we did see Candyman. We had to see Candyman. Candyman was an interesting time to talk about this idea of a horror franchise, right? What does it mean when we have a horror franchise? But we also talked about
centers on a Black character too.
Exactly. But then we also talked about this movement away from the city as a space with Black people in it that had diversity in terms of class to like the hellscape that Cabrini Green is represented as in Candyman, right?
Right.
You could actually see like these changes in terms of like how we see urban areas, how we connect that to Blackness, how it's then reflected in horror, right? And then you come around at the very end to Angry Black Girl and a Monster, where like a lot of it takes place in this sort of generic project, right? What does that mean, right? One thing that was interesting about the class is I had an epiphany watching Angry Black Girl and a Monster was that I never understood how to articulate it, but I never saw horror films as being necessarily hopeless. Right. And then that was, and there's something when I was watching that it really hit me. And then also reading Destroyer by Victor LaValle, and realizing that the thing that's interesting about the horror film is it's basically it's not an adventure film with a twist. It's just an adventure film. It's not an adventure film with a different ending. It's just an adventure film that stops at a different point in the timeline.
Right.
And
I think another movie like that is His House.
Yes.
That follows a Sudanese couple escaping war, coming to Britain, finally getting a house that some would basically consider not just dilapidated, but probably haunted, and how they resolve their lives there.
Exactly. And for me, the kicker is that the very notion of the final girl is really about hope. It's that with all of this stuff going on, life, there's life.
Yeah.
There is survival. And survival is the precursor for living. Survival is the precursor for growth. Survival, the act of survival, means that there is a future. And that's kind of interesting, because when you think about Afrofuturism, like come back to Afrofuturism, right? One of the classic statements about Afrofuturism is that billboard that a lot of non-Black people had a problem with, that just said simply, there are Black people in the future.
Yeah.
That there's that Afrofuturism very much exists in the space of resistance to all of these forces that don't want to see us in the future. And not being in the future is just a polite way of saying dead.
All right.
And the horror film, this notion of the final, that there's a final girl or a final boy or a final person in Black horror, right? At that point, it becomes transcendent, right?
Mm-hmm.
See, and in sort of a standard horror film where the Black person dies first, we've got all the tropes. It kind of reinscribes this idea that we are less than because we don't get to go into the future, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then in Black horror, where you have a Black woman who survives, right?
Mm-hmm.
You've said there are Black people in the future at that moment.
Right.
That is the ultimate resistance to death. That changes the changing of race in the context of our culture, changes the entire meaning of a horror film.
Mm-hmm. Which is brilliantly put. And it makes what Steve Barnes also said and some of his other stuff make even more sense. And it's like, yeah, I'm starting to take that in more now myself, even with the horror I'm trying to write in games and such. So, yeah, very much get it.
But I mean, those things matter. At least they matter to me. So yeah, so that's kind of the Ethno-Gothic, my take on the Ethno-Gothic and Afrofuturism in a nutshell.
I've beautifully put it. I think it's a continuation of the conversation I started with Tanana as well about Afrofuturism, and then we moved into talking about Black horror, as Black horror is a part of Afrofuturism, in that what you just beautifully surmise is it is about being there in the future.
Right. But they also represent very different paths, right?
Right. Different paths.
Yeah.
But still the aspect, we are there in the future.
Right. I did a series of I organized a series of themed panels once, and I'll never forget. It was the first panel was the superhero in ancient worlds, right?
Mm-hmm.
Something I'm very fascinated with because I'm very, there's a very archaeological sensibility to how I approach anthropology, right? I'm very much about like when I talk about race, I'm very interested in not race as a free-floating concept, but I'm interested in the way in which race becomes ground into artifacts. Some artifacts are concrete, some artifacts are ephemeral, right? Like the idea of a superhero is ephemeral, but that drawing of Superman or Icon is concrete, right?
Right, back to the ancient stories of Gilgamesh.
Right. But they're made by human hands. They're uttered by human beings, right? So again, we come back to what I said earlier about looking at the relationships that create. It's the relationships and also the processes that human beings engage in that create these ideas, right? Walter Benjamin has this amazing quote, and it's in one of his writings that a lot of people don't pay attention to, and I kind of bastardize it a little bit, but what he talks about is that history is a material fact that quite literally becomes the means through which we imagine, right? And when I started my research, the first thing I did was I took that phrase and I was like, oh, let's step back from this idea of history, which is very ephemeral, right? And let's talk about a comic book. Wow, that comic book made by human hands. It's an artifact that circulates through time and space, and it has characters in it, and those characters have identities, and those identities, they don't come out of casting. Like somebody started with a blank page, and that identity, whatever that identity was an overtly affirmative act, right? And so an affirmative act that creates an artifact that has notions of identity embedded within it in such a way that somebody can read it and it can influence the way in which they see their own identity. I'm like, oh, So yeah, so these artifacts, forget about the ideas, but the artifacts themselves become the
Mm-hmm.
means through which we imagine other possibilities. And that's how it's that logic is how I link up ideas and things in space and time, right? Because space and time become really important variables within any type of process or a relationship, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm very interested in these in the ways in which things are quite literally things, not just things, but things are generated, and those things become the means through which ideas are not just created but also circulated, right?
Mm-hmm.
Ideas don't really circulate. They circulate through artifacts.
Or in today's case, a meme.
Again, that's an artifact.
Mm-hmm.
You access it through an artifact.
Yep.
There is ultimately something concrete about our perception of any idea. Like people say, oh, well, sound isn't concrete. Well, it's vibrations.
Mm-hmm.
Sound actually has a physical presence, a physical manifestation.
Yep.
Like all of the stuff we actually, in order for our mind to even get to it, there has to be, it has to engage some sort of sense. And all of our senses are tied to certain types of physical manifestations.
Mm-hmm. Very much so. Which is
So
part of one of the key systems in the neuro experiential model, which is part of brain spotting. And we're going through the sensory system to be
right,
able to unpack and reach the trauma capsules that exist there.
right.
Yeah. So I'm going to segue us into this so we can start wrapping up. Because we're talking so much about relationship ideas and so forth. What do you think is a myth and reality around mental health, especially from what we've now branched into the Ethno Gothic as well as the Afrofuturism? And I know this may be a longer conversation than we have time, but let's start what we can.
I think that it's a myth that any of us are healthy.
Mm-hmm.
I think that we are on a journey.
Mm-hmm.
We are moving through space and time, right? And we are ever vigilant about the ways in which time is always wearing away at us. But I think that all of us are managing, just some people better than others. So
Yep.
the person who's not depressed is the person who's managing their depression better than anyone else.
Mm-hmm.
Or managing those feelings better than everyone else. They're deemed healthy because
They've been able to manage it.
because those feelings have not reached a point where it's like dragging them down right into the abyss. But ultimately there's some management there. It's not that someone is just intrinsically, I guess what I'm saying is that people are not just intrinsically just healthy. I think some people just have a better way of managing all of those things that can take them down, right? And I think
Right.
that also happens in terms of the physical cellular level, right? What is aging?
Mm-hmm.
When we're
Some of us
younger,
age better than others.
yeah, right. But I think that all things physical and psychological require ongoing attention, care, management, and vigilance.
Mm-hmm. Very true. Very true. And because I know one of the things I sometimes have to talk with clients is they talk about the languaging that they're using is fix me or broken. It's like it's a binary, is that if I'm broken, I need to be fixed. Well, guess what? If you can be broken and you can be fixed, you can be broken again.
Right,
Versus looking at it from that standpoint of, no, we need to manage this.
right,
And the idea of broken and fixed, like I said, in a binary, assumes that there is, like you said, this non-traumatized wonderful, blissful state that the people that do exist in that are frankly a fantasy.
Well, I mean, I would actually say that there is that state, but that state is never permanent.
Right. Well, and that's what I'm saying is the fantasy is
right.
that there is some place you can do that state and never leave that state.
Well, it's that you can get into that state and stop time, right? And I think that like for me, that's why I always talk about space and time, right? You know, that those things are literally always changing. You know, it doesn't mean that it and it's not a bad thing, right? But it's like gravity. Like you can only complain so much about gravity. It's there.
Right.
You know.
And believe me, I am so suppressing the urge to make Doctor Who jokes right now. Mavity.
Oh, well. I mean, yeah, I think that I think that you know, I don't know. It's hard because and when I think of like some of my conversations around things like that, like hope is important, right? There's no reason to move forward in the absence of hope, right? You know, but I mean, there's some people in my life that really drive home the extent to which joy is a practice. You know, there are some people in my life that there's one person in particular I'm thinking of, and you know, we've had conversations about this. You know, Yatasha Womack, you know, for her, it's very clear when you get to know her that joy is a process. Joy is not something that just comes to you. It is something that you seek out, that you create, that you have agency in, right? And sometimes joy is really freaking hard, you know. But the people I know, because I know several people who are like this, who are able to like keep that in the front of their mind. It's like what they're able to do, you know, like people are like, oh, you're just naturally optimistic. And I'm like, no, for that person, joy is a process. It's very clear to me, knowing them and seeing like they are seeking out joy, and they are like actively pushing away hopelessness. And you just happen to see them on a day when joy's winning.
Right.
You know.
Right. Which is also that fundamental joy of we will be here in the future.
Right.
So with that, I must thank you for an enlightening, enrapturing, so many different directions we've gone with this on this conversation that made it on the recording and didn't. And I definitely think we need to do a part 2 at some point. Maybe more in the comics. I don't know. We'll see what that is. But I want to thank you for coming on the show.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
And likewise. Where can folks find you if they want to find more of your work, support more of this, support more of the Ethno Gothic?
Well, I'm very much on social media. So for most social media, my handle is SW Carpenter. Short, you know, basically my initials SWC and then Carpenter, like my last name. And then, but the other way to find me is whether it's Facebook, Instagram, Blue Sky. There's lots of Stanfords, there's lots of Carpenters, but I so far am the only Stanford Carpenter.
Right.
So you can just look me up under Stanford Carpenter, like the university and the profession. You know, now you might get that Carpenter who's at Stanford University, but that you can find your way past that very quickly. But yeah, just hit me up. I'm on Facebook. I'm still on Twitter for a little while longer. Blue Sky, Threads, Instagram. I'm on Clubhouse, but rarely there.
Right.
But but yeah, so but it's all either SW Carpenter or Stanford Carpenter.
Right. All right. Well, I thank you again for the show, and we'll be hearing a few more things for Black History Month. I want to apologize for my listeners that we are having a bunch of rebroadcasts of past stuff because, unfortunately, life and some traveling I've been doing is unfortunate that I couldn't get as many of the episodes prepped for February as I normally like to. But we'll be back with more, so stay tuned. Here on Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered.
Thank you for tuning in for Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered. Be sure to join your host, Perry Clark, for another episode on the podcast coming soon on the Voice America Empowerment Channel.